Hi, my name is John Walsh. I run the channel Super Eyepatch Wolf and I've been playing fighting games my whole life, probably. My voice is kind of dead because it's day 4 of a con. I have been looking at fighting games for as long as I can remember. My uncle actually used to repair arcade cabinets. The first fighting game I really fell in love with is a friend brought over a PlayStation copy of Street Fighter Alpha 3. The vibes of that game, the art, the colors, the soundtrack, I completely fell in love with it, like going from, you know, being aware of fighting games and like liking them to just loving how every little frame was so full of expression and life. I credit that game with being one of the things that made me love media and art as much as I do. There's something so particular about like fighting games and the way they look and how those characters feel, and I think what it is that at their core, fighting games have these characters that are designed for you to see across a smoky arcade and be like, that's the coolest fucker I've ever seen. Can I curse?
Absolutely.
Okay, cool. I think you have to cram so much personality and so much life into these frames. And the example I always go to is Vanessa from KOF. She's one of my favorite fighting games of all time. And the reason why is like basically maybe 3 frames of animation. It's like she does her big super and she's so badass and she's so fucking cool. And then the handshake because she's after punching you too hard. And it's like just for that 1 second, she's like really cute and like really vulnerable. And it just brings this whole other dimension to her. And there's so many fighting game characters that have that. So I think it's that like instantaneous need to communicate what this being is and what they do that I love about like the kind of visual flair of like fighting games. But then you can extend that into the music, the voice lines, the name of their moves, like even like the kind of, you know, the kind of supers they have. Like Geese Howard is this old insane master who has just mastered shit no one else has, and that's communicated through the pretzel, through this impossible fighting game motion. And I love that because like there is a little bit of story there happening just on the pretzel motion for Geese Howard's move list. Virtua Fighter 4 Evo to me is the, I'm gonna say 3rd best fighting game of all time, but one that's maybe just like maybe more responsible for any other for me falling in love with like the mechanics of a fighting game. And what it was is like Virtua Fighter 4 came out and it was a big deal because it was the game that wasn't Tekken Tag. It was like this really big deal on the PlayStation, and it had like a fidelity that was I think nearly above those games. You had stuff like, you know, snow that would like kind of get carved as the characters were fighting. The Virtua Fighter aesthetic has always been a lot more pulled back than anything else, but there's like a sharpness to it. I always think of Virtua Fighter similarly to like Dragon Quest in that you're not going to see a whole lot that's like subversive or different in terms of like tone or characters, but every one of them is just so well done. Virtua Fighter 4 Evo came out and they added 2 new characters, Brad Burns and Go. I think there's so many bad ways to do the edgy character, but Go with his blue gi and his facial piercings and like he looks like a ghost, I was just immediately taken with him. I loved him so much. I was like, I don't even care how this dude plays. I just need to put hands on him. Nearly everyone in Virtua Fighter has jab, 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 or like triple jab or quadruple jab or whatever, and Go has this 1-2 that is so slow and so awful. I did that first and I was like, how am I ever gonna play this character? And then I realized like, okay, he has this entire directional focused grappling. I would get so much like enjoyment from maneuvering like the CPU into these really bad situations level wise, and I started like nearly going more for the level out than like, you know, just like a normal, you know, HP drain victory. Individually, there's no real one move you can point to Go and be like, this is what I'm always gonna come back with, this is what I'm always gonna like poke with. It was how to use those moves together and how you could take 2 of his moves, which by themselves seemed stupid and like ridiculous, but together they would just make this really complicated situation for your opponent to get out of. The big other thing about the Virtua Fighter 4 Evolution was its quest mode, and this was basically a simulation of you going around to all the arcades in Japan and fighting all the local players there. It had like a really, for the time, robust like character customization. It was really fun then going to the later arcades and seeing how much each character is dressed up. And by today's standards, it might be a little tame. Back then, it was just so good. One of the things I really loved about it is you were fighting like named CPUs. You might be fighting in Akira, but then that Akira would show up in a different arcade and you'd be like, oh, I know this guy. There was this one CPU. I think the CPU's name was like Holly Bell or something like that. Every time I would fight this CPU, I'd be like, oh God, here we go. Because he'd perfect me and then he'd just like wash me in the other 2 rounds. I never got a single round off against this character. I got to like the final arcade, and the way you beat the arcade is you have to win like a big long tournament, and if you lose one match, it's back to the start. I was in the top block and Halle Bell, this nightmare CPU, was in the bottom block, and I got to the finals and I beat him 3 rounds to nothing. I popped off harder in that moment than I have ever popped off against a human player. It was like this exorcism of this demon that had been haunting me for 40 hours, you know? Virtua Fighter 4 Evolution taught me the technicality of fighting games and like how subtle they could be, because on top of everything I've said, it had like the most insane tutorial. This was a PlayStation 2 game teaching you about meaties and fuzzy guards and the different ways you could guard against the throw escape before you're actually being thrown. Learning all that technical side of it and learning how to play Go and putting it all into action in this one match against this nightmare CPU, that is just one of the best experiences I have ever had playing games. I have a cousin who I love very dearly, but the dude is like, he's very bullheaded and he's very stubborn, and he is a good fighting game player, but the moment that he gets frustrated, he will just attack, and he stops thinking about defense. He's the exact same in arguments, you know, where it's like if he gets bullheaded, he'll just continue with a point that like, you know, doesn't work. I think it's really interesting that fighting games expose that same thing in him, and like we laugh about it like afterwards and stuff.
John,
Wooly,
your recommendation was to go out into the world and participate in a fighting game tournament. What happened?
My only experience with a fighting game in a tournament was when my co-host on the podcast Versus Wolves challenged me to enter a fighting game tournament. I played Tekken, and it was really intimidating. Sometimes I think like I don't have the confidence to engage in a certain situation, and fighting games like definitely expose that. I always know in fighting games I'm never quite aggressive enough. With any fighting game, I will just pick the character I love. I'll just be like, they look amazing. And Reina was basically Heihachi Mishima as a cool girl wearing street fashion. A guy sits next to me, he takes out a hitbox, and I'm like, oh geez, okay, here we go. And he picks Dragunov, and I'm like, I'm dead. But then we had the first round and I actually beat him, and I couldn't believe it. I was like, oh, whoa. And then we had the next round and I won that, and the next round and I won that. And I wasn't like washing the dude or anything. It was coming down to it every time. That was such a good feeling. I feel like when you fight someone like enough times, you eventually get a sense of the kind of person they are in a way that you would not from just a conversation. And that was like the high, and that was the moment where I was like, I get why people do this. The thing I always say about fighting games is I have spent more time drawing Chun-Li fan art than I have playing Chun-Li. You know, and that is kind of what it is to me. It is like the aesthetic. The level I play fighting games at, I never need to be the best at them or anything. I just need to be good enough to have good matches with people I care about. To be someone who really, really loves fighting games, I don't think you need to be labbing. I don't think you need to be looking at frame data. I think all you need is to love this shit and to love those characters. And I think especially, you know, in the last like 10 years, like the rise of social media and fan spaces, you can see that love everywhere. Like one of my favorite things is like when a new character comes out, like say Aki from Street Fighter 6, and just, you know, giving it like 6 or 7 hours and people are already doing all this crazy fan art of her. And like, I love that side of it so much. Her cutscenes, her voice acting, all the fan art of her, that is what brought that character to life for me. I've never quite nailed it down, but someday I want to do a video about like what is so fucking awesome about fighting games if you never plan on competing in Evo. There was a moment in Tekken 8, I don't want to get too spoilery, but a character takes a certain fighting stance, and the significance of them taking that stance blew me back you know, 25 years of playing Tekken. You know, I was thinking about playing my buddy in Tekken Tag. I was thinking about when Tekken 4 came out, and like, while it's not the best game, it had the sickest aesthetic and still does. I thought about every new release of Tekken, where I was in my life and what it meant, and like kind of growing up with these characters in a weird way. And I think that is what fighting games can be. Now we're at the point where, you know, Ryu's old. You know, Ryu is like, he is the sage kind of master now. You don't need to be able to parry Justin Wong. Like, you don't need to be willing to spend dozens and dozens of hours, like, you know, learning combo loops and like vortex traps and all that stuff. All that stuff is awesome, and it's still great, and it's still fighting games. But I think what fighting games are now is just, it's a universe of stuff, and it's something that like I am always up for like trying to get people into.